Hi, students. It's Dr. Rebecca Barrett-Fox here, your instructor for Introduction to Sociology. And in this module, we're going to examine markets and organizations. The subtitle gives us a little bit more of a clue about what this is going to entail, the sociology of economic life. And like so much of what we talk about in Introduction to Sociology, I know this is some content you have some firsthand experience with. You've been a consumer, maybe you have had a job, you participate um, in the economy. You might participate in an illegal economy as well if you've bought and sold things without paying taxes on them, for example. And those are all parts of the economic organization of our life. Well, in this introductory lecture, I'm going to give a lot of historical knowledge here. Um, our chapter gives obviously it has a sociological focus here, but there are some foundational historical concepts that I know that not everybody comes to college having that are, I think if you understand them, will help you understand the content of our textbook chapter better. So I'm taking a couple steps back from where our textbook might start and give us a history. I'm going to trace the history of where we got today in very broad strokes. If you're an economics major, you're an econ major, this will be some content that you will get in much more depth. I'm sure if you're a history student, you'll get in much more depth in other classes as well. But I'm going to give us some broad strokes so that as you read in our textbook about the concepts and key concepts, definitions, that sociologists use, you'll have some more content to apply them to. So I'm going to focus this lecture, as our textbook does, on Europe and the Americas. It doesn't mean that other parts of the world don't have economic activity. Obviously, they do. But the world's dominant economic system is capitalism, and that has been the case for hundreds of years now. And that comes out of Western Europe. So it doesn't mean that other economic systems don't currently exist. They do, or haven't existed, because they have. But the history it's important to just recognize, is coming out of this part of the world, and that's why we're focusing on it. Doesn't mean we couldn't tell the economic history of other parts of the world, but because the dominant global economic system is capitalism, we're going to trace that history. And we're going to start in the medieval period, in the prior to the 1300s. What was happening? Serfs were workers who lived on the land, and they were tied to their land owned by lords. They had an obligation to work that land. They worked to create food for themselves and food for the manor. That is the property where the Lord lived. And so you see in this painting, here they are performing some agricultural work with some pretty simple tools. And there was not a lot of pressure here to innovate. Not a lot of pressure to make agriculture more productive, because there were no rewards, there was no competition, and there were no profits. You didn't keep what you created. If you created more or less of it, that didn't change how much of it you got. There was trade. People would have traded things for other things, but you weren't really building up surpluses. You weren't building up wealth. And if you were a serf, there wasn't really anything to do with it anyway. And so, and for the manors themselves, agricultural productivity was sufficient to meet the needs of the royal classes, the lords and the landowners. But there weren't markets to go take your goods to sell them, right? So if it's not like they needed to produce extra to take them on the road to go sell them at some kind of market or ship them someplace, right? There weren't extensive roads. There wasn't extensive trade. And so a lot of this was limited by technology. Um, Something starts changing, though, in the late Middle Ages. There was a gigantic famine in the early 1300s, um, resulting as a result of crop failure. Estimates are up to the 80% of farm animals died. There's widespread starvation across Europe, even reports of cannibalism. Crime skyrocketed, which is not surprising when people are in physical distress. And rural population, some of this people shifting to urban areas, um, but also simply a lot of people dying. The Black Death, which is another word for the plague, the bubonic plague, doesn't just affect Europe, also affects Asia, but over time kills about a third of all of Europe. So if you look at artwork from this time period, you see frequent depictions of death. Here, dancing skeletons or of famine, because people were really suffering. At the same time, agricultural production reached its technological limit. For the tools that were available, people were producing about as much food as they could create. So without a technological advancement, we weren't going to get a lot more food. Now, this is obviously, as the name for this period suggests, a crisis. This is a very bad thing for the people who are suffering through it. The records we have at the time show a lot of suffering, a lot of hopelessness, and it produces some demographic changes. Demographic changes that ultimately, if we put aside the death and suffering, which is significant. So I'm not saying this is a good thing or even like a silver lining, but there is a change comes out of it that starts to advantage people who previous to this would have been low on the social ladder. Um, a bad thing that happens first is that landowners start to try to expand their holdings to increase production, right? There's a famine. You're not getting as much out of the land food out of the land as you want. So you got to have more land to get sufficient food. And that leads to war over land holdings. That leads to higher taxation and more suffering for poor people. At the same time, the available population for our workers has dramatically declined. And that gives workers more power. So agricultural workers, our serfs, are now in high demand. And so no longer do they have to put up with being stuck on the land, the manor where they were born. They start actually contracting with new landowners, right? The landowners go around looking for serfs to say, come and work my land. And now they sign contracts, or strike contracts, strike agreements. Then they become tenants rather than serfs. Now, if you know the word tenant farmer, we don't think of that as being a very powerful position, and it's not. It's not the same thing as being a landowner and working land that you yourself own and occupy, but it's better than being a serf. So this represents a shift towards workers. Moving forward just a little bit in time, we see some big environmental changes start as um, the population changes. Folks started heading off rural areas towards cities. London, in particular, is a very large city relative to other cities across Europe. Um, Road building, which contributes to infrastructure change is infrastructure change that opens new markets. And then very importantly, and I know our textbook goes into this great detail, an enclosure of the commons and resistance to that. So prior to this, there are common areas of public land where people can bring their animals to graze. And there's a move towards enclosing this, fencing this off, so that people without land of their own or sufficient land to graze animals now don't have places to bring their animals. And so this is a change to agriculture or to animal agriculture. It's also a shift in thinking about how land should be used and who's allowed to have access or allowed to have power over the environment. We see a quote in here from a man writing in 1649, Gerard Winstanley, who says, England is not a free people till the poor that have no land have free allowance to dig and labor the commons. That is, can you plant a garden there? Could you raise your animals in some kind of place? And um, when these enclosures happened, there was also resistance to them, people scaling the walls, people um, resisting the idea that land should only be for the wealthy. If you know something about American history, you know, maybe something about range wars out west, or in more recent years, the last decade or so, arguments about Bureau land management properties and whether sheep, cattle, and those kind of animals can graze on that property. So we still have some of these arguments today. What else is happening? Well, in starting in the 1440s, Europeans come to Africa, capture and enslave Africans, and start shipping Africans, some back to England, Portugal, the Netherlands, but the majority of the slaves they capture, they move to the New World, to North America and South America. And you see here people become treated like a commercial good, like a thing to be owned. Um, Slavery, this is not a history of slavery, but you know, just to note, there had been other kinds of slavery before this. Um, but this was a really different kind of slavery compared to what the world had seen before. And in this kind of slavery, people who were born into slavery were considered lifelong slaves, and all their children were considered lifelong slaves. And this would be race-based, which is very different than other kinds of slavery. I have a couple of dates in there. 1440s, that's when we get the first enslaved Africans purchased, you know, captured and purchased and sold by Europeans. The last slave ship that we know of coming out of Africa to the New World is doing that in 1873. That's long after the transatlantic, that is crossing the Atlantic Ocean from Africa to the New World, had been declared illegal. Um, and we don't know that that was the last one. Right now, we know that's the last one that's been historically documented, but we could find more. But it's not until 1888 that slavery is outlawed in the last location in the New World, and that's in Brazil. This changes the world in major and monstrous ways. It can't be separated from capitalism because enslaved Africans provide the human power and oftentimes expertise to build the structures of the New World, like literally building the roads, building the cities, and very much building the agriculture. Um, so rice, indigo, tobacco, eventually cotton. Um, in the North America and the colonies, um, in the Caribbean, South America, Central America, in the Caribbean, particularly sugarcane, which is the number one product that enslaved people would have worked, agricultural product that they would have worked to create. This gives is the energy behind settlement of the New World, colonization there. Not that there wouldn't, I want to make clear there was contact before this, but in terms of economic productivity, very much relies on the work of slaves. In the US, the British colonies and what becomes the United States for sure, even more so in Latin America, in nations like Brazil, which brought more slaves than any other place. In, far disproportionately, economic activity and productivity was performed by enslaved Africans and then their descendants. So this gives also pushes for the development of trade routes. Slaves create tobacco, farm tobacco, which is sent back to Europe. In the Caribbean, they raise sugar cane, which is turned into rum and is sent back to Europe. which is used funds to buy more slaves, to grow more sugarcane, to create more rum. You might know that that economic relationship known as the triangle trade, the relationship between Caribbean, Latin American, North American, and European markets around slavery and goods produced by slaves. So trade routes develop to cities where um, slaves are embark. They start their journey, and when they disembark, they end their journey. We develop navies to protect commerce on the sea. Certainly would have included slave ships, but more than that as well. And with navies comes naval warfare. So a long period of fighting between England and Spain and France for who would dominate those routes. The diagram here is of a ship called the Brooks. The image comes from the University of Virginia Special Collections, and each figure on this diagram would have represented a person. So this would have been people just packed in like sardines, just shoulder to shoulder to shoulder. The ship was authorized to carry 482 enslaved people, but it often carried as many as 760. If this is a period of history, or if these are stories from history, because it's a long period of history that interest you, I really encourage you to read the stories of resistance on slave ships, like at the Amistad is a significant story of a slave ship rebellion. We don't know all the numbers of people who were kidnapped and trafficked. We have records of some, but certainly not records of all, and that's important work for historians to continue to do. Happening at the same time. In Europe, in particular, we see the rise of mercantilism. This is when you organize an economy so that a nation exports more than it imports, that your nation, you want to be selling more than you're taking in. And you prioritize importing things that you can't make at home. So if you can make it in the home nation, you want to make it there. And the idea here, the kind of the underlying assumption is that there's a limited amount of resources in the world, and you want to be selling more of them than you're buying, right? And so it's just like your own can't say checkbook. I don't know if that's a metaphorical checkbook. In your own bank account, you want to have more money coming in than going out. And so every nation is trying to get an economic advantage over other nations by selling more than they are importing. And this made for a very busy time of trade and the development of technologies of trade, like ports and navies and is just what and piracy on the other side of things. Also rose up around this. Our image here is from a Dutch port in the late 1600s, just showing the level of activity. And you see kind of implied here the internationalism. If you look at the different ways that the sailors are dressed and the busyness of it. So there would have been a lot of contact between people, but again, kind of in a kind of nationalistic competition. By the mid 1700s, things are starting to change. There had always been markets. People had always been able to take their things to sell. Covent Garden Market, which is in London, is depicted here in a picture, a painting from the 1700s, but had actually been there far longer. But so market is in one definition of a market is like a place where you go to buy and sell and trade, kind of like a supermarket or a yard sale, or even like a church bazaar, right? Or a antique flea market where different vendors have booths. But that's not what we mean here when we start to talk about markets in a capitalistic way. Now we're talking about large networks of trade and the development of financial tools. So we're not just bartering, we're seeing that people are developing credit and debt, for example, mortgages, different lending tools. So you could start to expand, kind of betting on yourself to pay back loans. Or if you were a lender, you could bet against someone that they wouldn't be able to, and you'd take the collateral that they had used to secure their loans. And so the financial tools just become more complex. And we also find here that landless, no, we have now landless people with the enclosure of the commons. People know who are no longer serfs and no longer have land of their own and are increasingly living in urban areas, realize they can't produce what they need to survive, right? When you're all on the manor, the manor itself is producing what you need. Now you can't produce what you need. So what do you have to do? You have to buy it. And now you're a consumer market. So it becomes a much larger market for people needing to buy things. During this process, the more powerful people in the society, wealthier people, they had accrued capital. Capital is the money and the stuff needed to produce more stuff. And so that can be like material stuff to make more stuff. So the actual things to make things, which we are going to see comes to mean a factory. So by the 1700s, late 1700s, we start the Industrial Revolution. And this is it has world-shaking consequences. This is the rise of machines to do work for people. That cuts the costs of labor because not everything has to be done by hand anymore, even though a lot of people are still involved in this. But production increases dramatically. And this also allows more profit to flow to the owners of those machines. The people who own the means of production, they own the things that are necessary to make more things, make ever more money. And so we see this becomes a dangerous pattern with some very negative social consequences. We can see very much also the positive social consequences, right? We can get more stuff. We don't have to make every item individually. We can have interchangeable parts. We can have consistency of quality. These are good things that make life they make life easier. They make life more comfortable. They allow people to have more leisure time because they're not having to simply take care of their most immediate needs. But there are some pretty negative consequences too. And for a good part of our history, our industrial history, this growth is unchecked and unregulated, which is why pictures like this of children working in mills. And so these are young children working in mills, working in coal mines, working in factories, rolling cigars, making paper. And it's not that children had not worked when they were on farms, right? Children worked on the manor, they worked on the family farm, but this was factory work was different. It wasn't seasonal. So when you work on a farm, it's not that there's always work to do on a farm, but there are time periods when there is less work to do. But in a factory, work can happen perpetually. It can happen all the time, especially when we have gas to run lights, so you can work a factory 24 hours a day. Many factory workers today continue to work round the clock, second and third shift. And for children, that's not good for any person, but it's especially, not good for children. The machines they were very dangerous, very dirty, produced a lot of pollution and toxins, things that were not good for children or anybody to be exposed to, but particularly for people with growing bodies and growing brains. And so these things are pretty negative for children. Again, children had worked on farms, but the work and farm work is also dangerous, but not as dangerous as factory work. And particularly the pollution is not as dangerous. The machines are not as dangerous. The pace is not as fast, and it is not as relentless. So this changes how we treat children. How does this arise? Well, it takes a number of factors coming together. A very important one being the creation of steam power. The picture here is from a magazine illustrating in 1807 Robert Fulton's Clermont, um, which is the ship that Robert Fulton, the debatable inventor or of steam power, but certainly the first person who makes it profitable, creates. And I will share that Robert Fulton is from my hometown. Two of our elementary schools are Fulton Elementary and Claremont Elementary School. So every kid in my town knows these stories. Um, that creation of steam power, it means that we now have machines that can move themselves. And we're going to see it with a steam engine, and then like trains engine like that, but other kinds of steam engines that can start to um, move machinery in factories. So this contributes to trade because these steam engines, steamboats can now cross the ocean, not relying on wind power. They can sail up and down rivers, not relying again on wind. This is a huge difference. And our factories pick up the same kind of power. So that gives us factories. With factories come urbanization, right? Factories are going to be in places where people are. And when people find that they can go to a factory for work, they do. So we have urbanization that goes along at the same time. Clocks might seem like a surprising thing to include in the list of material culture that makes difference in how people relate to their work. Clocks have been around for a lot longer than factories, but we start organizing our lives according to a clock. So homes would have had clocks in them before, but the sense that things started and ended at precise times and that you measured your life according to the clock. That's only really starts in the early 1800s. If you're not a super punctual person, I encourage you to take some time to mourn the fact that there was a time that we didn't operate so much on a clock like we tend to now. This also coincides with the development of railways, which have to run in a precise schedule, right? So a train comes in a minute, that's estimated to the minute, and it leaves to the minute. If you've traveled by train or subway, you know that every minute matters with railways. And so we start to divide out life according to minute by minute. And we do that with commerce and transportation as well. Again, slavery, a big part of the Industrial Revolution. The invention of the cotton gin eventually elongates the slavery because it makes cotton production more valuable. There's had been some hope, some thinking that prior to the invention of the cotton gin, which helps process cotton plants, slavery was not a very effective not a super cost effective way to manage cotton-based agriculture. With the invention of the cotton gin, cotton becomes more profitable, and slavery is protected as an institution because there's economic interest in maintaining slavery. That also contributes to westward expansion as agricultural leaders in the U.S. Now that slavery was technological innovation allowed slavery to be profitable in the support of the production of cotton, pushed cotton production westward into Texas. And so slavery powers the Industrial Revolution. Slavery in the South is used to create cotton. Where does that cotton go? It goes to the north to factories in Massachusetts, factories in England. And so even though these places where oftentimes by now slavery was abolished, it was illegal and wasn't practiced, they were still relying on slave labor economically for cotton that they would turn into cloth. The Industrial Revolution is also powered by finance and credit, people being able to borrow and lend. Practically, iron which goes into the making of steel, literally builds our factories, which literally build our cities, which go and our factories go back to produce more steel. We see this particularly on the American East Coast in cities like Pittsburgh, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, Youngstown, Ohio, places that really were produced, literally created the tools and the tools that then built America. In terms of agriculture, the steel tip plow comes along during this time period and changes how farming is done. And so the steel tip plow allows farmers to break harder ground, which allows the Midwest to be opened to agriculture, changing the shape of the prairie, changing westward expansion. Prior to this, people moving from east to west generally were skipping over Kansas and Nebraska because it was too hard to farm. It was called the Great American Desert. It was too dry for what they typically grew, and the ground was, because of the density of the prairie grasses, was too difficult um, to plant in. The steel tip plow allows for that land to be broken up, with both, again, real negative consequences for some folks, like the indigenous people who lived here, and for the environment, which uh, was a wonderful, vast prairie land, but good for food production, and good eventually for trade and commerce. All of this changes the world in dramatic ways. This is a image here, a drawing of the bridge of the Monongahela River in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Pittsburgh is spelled incorrectly there. That sounds nitpicky, but I'm a Pennsylvanian, so well, you know that Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania has an H on it. Pittsburgh, Kansas doesn't. So in this national magazine, they got that wrong. Pictures from 1857, and you see we've got a steamboat, we've got some barges, we've got some horses unloading barges, and then look at the skyline, just how many factories are out here in Pittsburgh. The consequences are significant for social relationships. One, the rise of factories divides home and work. Prior to this, the work that you did, for most people, not for everybody, you did at home, right? You worked on a farm, which was your home, or maybe you were a butcher and you lived above your butcher shop, or you were a cooper and you had a shop out back, or you're a farrier, you shoot horses and you had a shop out back. And so men and women in married relationships worked more alongside each other. Children worked alongside their parents. As factories developed, some women did work in factories, and some industries, like textiles in particular, heavily employed women, single women, and low income single women, right? If you had enough money not to work, you didn't. But if you needed to create an income and you were single, you could enter the labor force that way. And I want to recognize that for some women, that was a positive thing. It allowed them to leave lives they didn't like behind, go into urban areas, develop more independence. Even for women who did that successfully, it was not always a positive experience. And for women who were left behind when men went off to work, it was a shift in their role too, because they were no longer working alongside their husbands in a family business, but the business side of the family got a shift to paid employment that relied on someone else, and that left more housework, homework, and childcare for women. So we actually saw kind of a reduction in the scope of activities that women did. And we also started seeing women's activities as not as part of economic production. That is, men went to work, men did the economic activity, and women did the home stuff. And we kind of forgot in that doing that home stuff also allowed for economic production, right? If a wife was not at home caring for the children, making the food, caring for the home, then the husband couldn't have been off to work. When they were both at home working alongside of each other, even if there was a division of labor based on gender, there was still a sense of a woman's participation in making that economic activity happen. And so that gets a little bit lost, and we see a sharper division between public, private, home and work, and men's lives and women's lives happening here. I already mentioned the rise of child labor as people move to urban areas. We see a lot more pollution. Um, the the um, the pollution in cities becomes remarkable. This gives us one of our most famous studies of evolution. You might know Darwin's study of moths. And some gray moths survive at a higher rate than white moths. And really the reason is that the skies and the are so blackened by pollution, and there's so much pollution on the trees that there's a genetic advantage to blending or survival advantage to being gray. And that's because the environment we change the environment so quickly with our factories. We also have a shift now to working hourly and working piecemeal. So prior to this, you worked until a job was completed, and you were generally paid for completing the job. Now people are paid hourly, and they're paid for showing up and for doing one part of a job. And so you don't build, a wheel. You're not a cartwright as a person who builds a wheel. You wouldn't have built a wheel from start to finish, but you would have been built one part of a wheel. And maybe you do that over and over and over again. You don't create a whole piece of cloth like a weaver would have done, right? You just create a little piece of it. And so people uh, don't develop maybe the expertise and the satisfaction that comes with expertise from developing a skill, which doesn't mean these jobs aren't skilled. Um, they would have still required to be being attentive, um, and knowing what you were doing. But the idea of being an artisan who completes a project and having that as part of your identity starts to shift. So workers start to lose that. All of this is leads to the production of excess wealth that goes up. It's flows toward the people who own the means of production. So the people who own the factories get wealthier and wealthier. People who work in the factories don't. Now, would they have been wealthier than if they stayed on the farm? For sure, for some of them, not for all of them. They faced new dangers that they didn't have in other jobs, and less satisfaction. And again, this is for everybody. Um, Working in factories than working as artisans. And I'm not romanticizing being an artisan. There are plenty of people who are cartwrights and or wheelwrights, um, and farriers and leather workers who did not like their jobs, I'm sure. But we start to see what we call the alienation of labor. People not feeling alienated from, there's a distance between how they're using their labor, using their energy, and what they're producing. This also gives rise to the titans of industry, names like Andrew Carnegie, the Rockefellers, incredibly wealthy people who gained tremendous wealth through industrialization and give back. Some, not all, and we could argue that they certainly didn't give back enough, um, but give back um, some of their funds. And so you've probably heard of like the Rockefeller Foundation, or Carnegie Mellon University, or Carnegie Libraries. This is a push to have um, um, a push to have um, public libraries accessible to more people. And so the philanthropy is the giving away, the charitable donation of large sums of money in ways that shape the public experience. We see across Europe during this time period an imperialistic push. The US is moving east to west. That's a kind of imperialism too. Colonizing, taking more land from the indigenous people here. But it's not until the 1900s that America starts to dabble in that abroad, in the Philippines, for example, Guam, Hawaii. Um, I, I guess I shouldn't say abroad because when we're pursuing Manifest Destiny and the creation of a America from the east, from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean, there were people there too, First Nations, indigenous people. Um, but we don't go farther from home into nations that we recognize as separate nations until the 1900s. But Europe was very busy doing this in the 1800s and doing this in Asia, in Africa. England fought two what are called Opium Wars in China to force China to open to trade, basically from Europe. England colonizes India, um, a huge population of people, and a huge landmass. And then across Europe, European nations start to carve up Africa and take colonies out of Africa. And you see in this political cartoon from the time period, this is reflected here with the mother country um, seated at the dinner table. And look at what's coming towards her. Her colonies are carrying in gold and silver, precious metals, foodstuffs, spices, fruits, and raw materials, rubber, timber. If you think about England, it is tiny. It's very, very small, and doesn't have a lot of, it has raw materials, but maybe not for as large of a population as that it wanted to support in the ways that it wanted to support it. But this comes at great cost to other people. Between 1880 and 1920, um, British colonial policies in India killed more than 100 million people. So in 40 years, 100 million Indians, that's people from India, that's 1/3 of the American population today, roughly 1/3. Um, that's more than all the famines of the Soviet Union, the famines of China, and the famines of North Korea combined. This is an extraordinarily cruel set of policies, um, in order for England to take and take. Imperialism is that process of taking resources out of a country. It can involve putting your own people there. That's one kind of colonization, but it doesn't have to. So, like when Britain colonized in the New World, it sent a lot of people to the Americas and they displaced the indigenous people here. Not entirely, there's certainly still indigenous people here, but to a great extent. Um, did. Or it doesn't have to be an occupying force. It could be a minority of people. And so there's never been more British people or their descendants in India than there were Indians. And yet there is still tremendous harm. Imperialism justifies in the minds of the imperialists or the colonizers the taking of resources from one place to send it to another. So sending those resources back to Europe. When Britain colonized in the Americas, um, we had those 13 original colonies. Lots of timber was coming back. A beaver was coming back. Tobacco was coming back. Um, as European nations carved up Africa and took resources out of it. They do two things. They've taken those resources out of Africa, bringing them home or sending them elsewhere, to Asia, for example, but to turn them into consumer goods. And then creating markets in those colonized nations to sell those goods back to. So, for example, taking cotton out of Africa, bringing it to Europe, turning it into cloth, selling the cloth back to Africa. And for this reason, we say that Africa in particular is not a poor continent. Africa has tremendous riches, particularly in precious minerals. Right? If you look at in detail in your cell phone or your laptop, this is a very often these are African products. These because the metals are coming from Africa that are used to create those products. They are shipped to China, where they're assembled, and then they're sold through American or European countries for a profit, to American business owners and American stock owners and European stockholders, people who own stock in those companies, and not to the benefit of Africans. So we are globalizing through imperialism. Resources are being shifted around, from countries that we come to call poor to countries that have oftentimes more technological innovation, more infrastructure, and sometimes it's simply stronger militaries to enforce it. And we're using new kinds of technology to transport those goods, like the Suez Canal, um, which lets ships traverse some pretty difficult waters and dramatically shortens the time it takes to travel the globe. And then in the US, the Transcontinental Railroad, right here on the left, we have a picture of the Golden Spike, the last spike that was put in the railway road that united the western half of the railroad and the eastern half of the railroad. There's this in Utah, is where it was. Well, the two halves of the railroad came together and let people be able to traverse the whole country and goods to travel the whole country east to west, through by train. Right, so these are significant technological transportation changes that make globalization even easier, the global traffic of and trade of goods. Capitalism is rising at this time period, but the problems with it are already pretty clear. It is hard on human bodies. Factory work is hard on people. It's hard on your knees, it's hard on your lungs, it's hard on your sleep habits, it's hard on your joints, it's hard on your hearing. Mm. And the profits of industrialization are not being shared equally. Maybe we wouldn't expect that, but also not fairly. The people who are being most harmed by this, children working in factories, children breathing the dirty air produced by factories, they're not receiving the benefits of it. In 1917, in Russia, we see the development of an alternative to capitalism develop. Out of the sociological writing of Karl Marx, who was German, though wrote while living in England, wrote the majority of his most important stuff comes from a time he was living in England. He had been writing before this, but his philosophies, his writing had been picked up by Russian thinkers. And some of them push for a revolution. Now, Marx had died in 1883. So Marx was not like an architect of this. It's men like Lenin, who's in a picture here. Russia at this point is still operating really as a nation of serfs. So think about at the start of this lecture where the Europeans were in the 1400s, Russian economy is in a lot of places still working that way. And Lenin had a real desire to fast forward the economy, modernize the economy, and provide, but not make capitalism's mistakes, and find a system that could benefit everyday people more fairly. Now we could definitely delve into more of his history and say, well, that was that really his intention, but that was the professed intention here. It was an economic transformation of the Soviet Union, and that happened. I said Russia and then the Soviet Union. Part of this revolution involved bringing together what had been disparate nations into a single Soviet Union, or sometimes the USSR, United Socialist Soviet States, or Union Republic, excuse me, the USSR. Um, Creating one of the largest populations in the world. And there was truly a lot of revolutionary stuff that happened here. That it was an appealing transformation for many people. It was a successful transformation for many people, certainly not for everybody. And so don't mishear me in saying that, but I want to also recognize that parts of this worked all right, given where Russia was coming from, um, and the Soviet Union, and where the Soviet Union landed. But there was also considerable harm, one that affected many people of Kansas, was a famine in the Ukraine. So in Ukraine was one of these states of the Soviet Union that had republics that had became together to be the Soviet Union. The Holodomor is the name of a man-made famine. Everybody, all historians agree that it was a famine, and it was created by policy, um, the economic agricultural policy of the Soviet Union. There's disagreement about whether the intention was to create a famine, or if the intention was something else, and then it was just a poor policy, or it was a poorly executed policy. But many people died of hunger. And this is also a time when we saw immigration from Ukraine, particularly to the Midwest in Kansas. So Ukrainian farmers had already been coming from Ukraine to Kansas, but there was a increased effort to bring them here, and also families of Kansas families who had family members in Ukraine also brought them here and brought them also to Canada. And they brought a lot of farming techniques that also shaped Kansas farming here. And so there's a little relationship between these two places. A lot of suffering during this, but also some success. Now, our textbook makes the point that that the communist alternative to capitalism failed for a number of reasons, and the book lists one, that the communist countries, primarily the Soviet Union, invested very heavily in their military. That it was a strategic um, part of the US's that was part of the US's strategic dealing with the Soviet Union, was to engage in an arm race, basically to force the Soviet Union to spend its money on military growth, in order to be able to meet a real or perceived American threat. And so, in some ways, we simply outspent the Soviet Union until it couldn't bear the costs anymore. Whether that's a good use of funds, and I don't want to suggest it's the only part of why communism failed, but I do want to I raise it as a point to notice that that's not necessarily a failure of communism on its own. Had the US in particular not put the Soviet Union and communism kind of in our sights and tried to drive it out of business, I guess, to use an economic metaphor, that doesn't mean it would have necessarily have survived, but we certainly did our part, for good or for bad, to end it. In 1929, we saw the first a landmark major worldwide depression. There had been economic turmoil in the world before that had global implications, certainly. Um, but the Great Depression was unique in that it had such huge and long-term implications and was now happening in a modernized world where labor looked different, jobs looked different, and economic productivity was just very different. In 1929, there's a stock market crash. And basically, it was unrestrained capitalism. There were not a lot of laws regulating banking. If you put money into the bank, if any, it wasn't insured. If that bank got robbed, you lost your money. If that bank burned down, you lost your money. And um, so a lot of everyday people lost a lot of money. You might be familiar with this famous photo by Dorothea Lange from 1936. It's called Migrant Mother. It's of a migrant worker, her and her family. She was an agricultural worker picking food in California, and her family, two children kind of tucked over her shoulders and then one at her breast, looking out, very worried about her future. Lang was hired by the Franklin Roosevelt administration, he was the president, to document the suffering of agricultural workers, in part to raise support for his policies, his federal policies to address high rates of unemployment and labor exploitation. And so that's why the photo was taken. And it became a very famous one. So a lot of people really suffering. We see this in the social world. The suicide rate increases dramatically, um, and which oftentimes goes with economic downturns, unfortunately. And so a lot of social stress on families, a lot of internal migration, people leaving Kansas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Dust Bowl states where over farming and improper care of land management um, had created a drought or contributed to the consequences of a drought and left agricultural workers unemployed. They headed to California, Oregon, places that didn't have the same environmental problems. So a lot of shifting around in the population and a lot of internal stress. There's other economic downturns. The 1970s saw one. But the next big one is 2008, what we call the Great Recession, a play on that Great Depression. And again, having significant global consequences. Um, if you were living in the US at the time, you probably experienced it most through home foreclosures. And that's because we were in a subprime mortgage crisis. That means there had been a lot of shady lending, banks giving home loans to people who clearly could not afford them, or home loans that were really predatory. So it looked like you were getting a good deal on a mortgage, but if you got into the fine print, it really wasn't a good deal. And banking deregulations allowed banks and other financial institutions to bundle bad loans together, sell them to other lenders, and eventually the whole thing starts to crack apart because people can't pay these mortgages. And you see neighborhoods like this where every house is for sale. And the value of houses fell dramatically for most Americans. Your job and your home, if you are fortunate enough to own your home, are your sources of wealth. And so this got wiped out, and then also giant turmoil in the stock market. And the other place where people have wealth is in their retirement savings, which for most people now is through the stock market, and some or bonds in some kind of fashion is tied to the larger economy. And so people finding their retirement savings wiped out. The pain of this was very significant, and really disrupted to individual lives and discouraging to a lot of a lot of people, both retirees who found that they were losing their job, or people close to retirement, older workers who lost their job and found they couldn't get back into a tight job market, as well as young people starting off who simply maybe had bought a house, couldn't sell it. A lot of people were called underwater. That means they owed more in a mortgage than the value of their house. So a very disruptive time. Internationally, this is particularly hard on Greece. Um, uh, Spain had some troubles too. But in Europe, there was a lot of disruption as well. This brought us to a time of just increased awareness that the US had a lot more economic inequality than our peer nations. This data comes from the World Bank, and it is a measure of inequality in a country. Um, so the darker the color, the greater the economic inequality. And the US has more economic inequality than any of our peer nations. Now, that doesn't mean we're the darkest here on the map, right? There are countries like South Africa that have higher rates of inequality. But when we consider the nations with advanced economies, democratic governments, high levels of technology, we consider high levels of freedom and people being able to make choices about their own lives. The US is by far the worst. So when we compare ourselves to like Japan, Australia, and Western and even Eastern European nations, we're not doing very well in terms of economic inequality. So what happens next for capitalism? If capitalism really takes off because we're making stuff in factories, and we can sell that stuff for cheaper than it costs to make it, and the people who own the means of production to make it get to take that profit. What happens when our economy is no longer about making stuff? Now, granted, like people will always like stuff, but increasingly what's valuable in our economy isn't the stuff we make, but the stuff we know, right? And that's a little harder to make money on and to turn into a dollar because you can't sell it the same way that you can sell a piece of iron, right, or a piece of cloth. So there's some questions about what will happen to capitalism. Some people think this is not a big deal, we'll be okay. Other people say, no, this is a big change. We'll also have to recognize that we are facing climate disaster. 2023 broke record after record for heat globally. We saw tremendous wildfires across the globe, particularly in South America and in Greece that had huge impacts on the environment. I'm sorry, not just the environment, but the economy as well. So recognizing that the extractive industries that much of our industry has relied on, coal, oil, extractive industries are ones that take energy out of the earth. They might have to be curtailed or will continue to face disaster. Is there can that survive alongside capitalism, or will capitalism have to change for us, or maybe fade away for people to have to survive? Those are questions that sociologists of markets and of economics think about a lot. Questions for us to think about as we engage this module are: what are capitalist markets? You've got an idea of that already from this lecture. What are the varieties of capitalism in the world today? What's the sociological approach to the study of economic markets? And why are organizations important for social and economic life? And things like businesses, unions, the banking as an industry, and all kinds of other organizations as well. Well, I hope that you enjoy this module. And as always, if you have questions, let me know.